right? Anything that's in the Quran, none of that is relevant. I'm simply asking if there's an argument that one ought to believe that the Quran is a reliable guide to God's beliefs and desires, right?
Yeah, and what I'm saying is that in order to try and prove the Quran, I would have to already believe that the Quran is false.
Why?
Because the Quran says that you can't change people's opinions about God.
Well, you're just begging the question of the interpretation there, right?
What do you mean
simply
the question of the interpretation? It says what it says.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that just because there's a literal meaning, that doesn't mean that it should be interpreted literally, right? So you need to have some kind of principle of interpretation that's independent of the text to establish that. And I'm asking, and so that's going to depend
the basics of language,
No, basics of language don't dictate, right, that text should always be interpreted literally, right? And in any case, you would already be assuming facts about, because if in fact the Quran is reporting God's utterances, right? If it's a record of God's utterances, right, you'd be making assumptions about what it is, how God would like to be interpreted, right? You'd be making those assumptions from the text itself, which is to argue in a circle. So we don't want to talk about the text at all in order to avoid that circularity. We want to know what independent basis you have, right? A, for believing that the text is a reliable guide to God's intentions, and B, what interpretive principles we should apply in order to be able to understand it.
Well, if you're asking me to take something outside of the Quran and then use it as a lens to view the Quran, I'm not going to.
So you're just saying you don't actually have any justification for believing that the Quran is a reliable guide to God's intentions, or that any interpretive principles you hold are actually reliable ways to interpret God's utterances.
Well, I believe that my hermeneutical, or that the hermeneutical method I use is justified on the basis of logic and fundamentals of language. I would say that. No.
It can mean anything by an utterance, right? So there isn't.
So if I say the sky is blue, am I saying that the sky is red?
You could mean that.
Yeah, right? There's no point in having this conversation then.
So you think that somebody couldn't mean the sky is red by saying the sky is blue? If I say,
generally speaking, when somebody says the sky is blue, I'm going to assume it's blue.
Yeah, that's conceding my point, right? Which is that there's no logical entailment, right? Which is what I said at the outset, and which you contested. Okay, so again, you can't just appeal to logic, right? Because there isn't a logical entailment there. Right, it's consistent with the existence of a God, right, for him to mean anything by any utterance, right? So all you're doing is conceding that you don't have an argument, that, in fact, that you don't have any justification yourself for your belief that the Quran is a reliable guide to God's.
Well, if we can't have, sorry,
and also that you don't have any justification whatsoever for using the interpretive principles that you use to interpret the Quran.
So, I mean, I'm not going to have a discussion with you if you believe that language is absolutely subjective, because I'm just going to interpret everything you say as confirming my...
I didn't say that language was absolutely subjective. What I said is that it's consistent with the existence of a speaker for the speaker to mean absolutely anything by any given utterance, right? You need to resort to other evidence, right, to rule out certain interpretations as inconsistent with the speaker's intentions. You can't start from the fact alone, right, that we ought to read a text literally, right, as a default without some prior justification for that position. And that claim, right, is not something that's derivable a priori, right? Because somebody could just be a speaker who in general should not be interpreted literally, right? So you'd need to appeal to something further you'd need to appeal to something further to establish that the speaker in question is not that kind of a speaker, right? And what you're saying is you don't have any basis for thinking that.
I mean, if we're not going to agree that the word, al-shams means the sun, if we're not going to agree that al-kafirun means disbeliever, and if we're not going to agree that la means not or no, then we're not going to have this conversation. I mean, you can talk about the subjectivity. Let me finish. You're talking about the subjectivity of language, and what should be interpreted literally, what should be interpreted metaphorically. And the answer is, if I say the sky is blue, I'm literal until proven metaphorical.
Yeah, that's begging the question.
No, okay, you can say begging the question all you want, but for all intents and purposes, let me finish.
Because it is begging the question. That's why I say.
Zero, do you understand why it's begging the question, though? Do you like?
I understand that it can be considered circular logic, but if we're not going to concede that language is objective, we're not going to have it, because I'm just going to interpret everything you say in my opinion.
I'm not making the claim that language isn't objective. Right.
Okay, if you're making
I'm saying that it's consistent with the existence of a speaker, right, for any utterance to mean absolutely anything, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a fact of the matter about what the speaker means by the utterance, right? But just from having a speaker alone, with no further facts about the speaker, we can't attribute any single interpretation, right? We can't justify any interpretation, right, on that basis alone, right? We need to have further evidence about the speaker to understand what his intention is by an utterance. That's to say that the text doesn't interpret itself, right? So I'm simply asking if you have some kind of independent standard by which to do that. And it sounds like you're saying no. So we agree. You don't have a justification for your belief in, that the Quran is a reliable guide to God's intentions, and you don't have a justification for your belief that some set of interpretive principles are the correct ones to apply in interpreting that document, right? And that's all that I wanted you to agree to, right?
So, I mean, if you're gonna say it like that, yeah, I'll concede. Believe whatever you want about me, but if when the Quran says La ilaha illallah, when it says there is no God but God, I'm going to interpret that as there is no God but God. I'm sorry if that's not rational to you. I'm sorry if that's some massive leap of Can I? You tell me to stop interrupting you when I interject, and then you constantly butt in when I'm speaking.
Yeah, do you know why I do that?
It's not justified under any circumstances, unless I'm going on a super long tirade, longer than any tirade you gave.
But I've already addressed your point, so I don't understand why you're saying that, right? You haven't been able to refute anything that I've said, right? You're merely begging the question again. Why are you doing it?
Oh, okay. Why should...
I asked you multiple times if you had a non-question begging argument, which is to say a non-circular argument in this case, right? So if you're just going to say, yeah, no, I don't actually have a non-circular argument, but fuck you, I'm just going to use a circular argument, we're not interested in that, right?
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I'm going to presuppose the literal until proven metaphorical state of language that is used by practically everyone on the planet. I'm sorry if that's circular logic.
The point is that you don't have any justification for believing that that's the right method to use with God.
And what is the justification for why I shouldn't use it with you?
I don't see what the relevance of that is.
No, it's incredibly relevant, because otherwise I don't have any methodology to properly understand your argument. If you want me to understand what you're saying, you're going to have to provide me with a methodology for distinguishing what is literal of your speech and what is not literal. And if you say it's literal, I'll just interpret that metaphor.
That's fine if you'd like to do that. right? All I was interested in doing was establishing that you don't have any justification, right? If you prefer to believe, right, that I should be interpreted in some way wildly at variance with what you take to be the literal meaning of my words, that's perfectly fine. I'm not interested in having that debate with you, right? I'm merely establishing the fact that you don't have any justification whatsoever, right, for thinking that that interpretive principle is the correct one to apply to God, to God's utterances, right? You're merely begging the question that that's the correct thing to do, right? What you're trying to do is engage in some kind of tu quoque, right? Saying that I can't give some justification that you ought to interpret me, right, with the principle that we should use the literal meaning as the default, right, until we have evidence that contradicts it, right? Whether or not that's the case is entirely relevant to my contention, right? You don't have an argument to justify that interpretive principle, right? You're merely begging the question of that principle, and you don't have any justification for thinking that the Quran is a reliable guide to God's beliefs and intentions, right? And that's all that I wanted to establish.
So no language is intelligible if you do not go. I mean, no language is actually intelligible if you go to it without the principle of literal until proven metaphor.
You haven't established that.
How have I not established? Okay, try and make any consistent statement without presupposing that principle.
Again, that's not an argument for your claim.
It's not an argument for my claim, but it's an argument for something underlying my claim, which is the principle on which I would interpret the. Now, if you're not going to concede that in language that it should be a general rule that everything is literal until proven metaphorical, then we can't have a debate about anything.
Can you give an a priori argument that's the only way that one can interpret utterance?
I mean, an a priori argument would be the impossibility of the contrary, and I hate to say that word, but I will. If everything is either everything is metaphorical until proven literal, or everything is literal until proven metaphorical, because
that's just repeating the claim, right?
I'm not. I am repeating the claim, but I'm doing it to back up an argument, which is if you go into things with the contrary, that is, everything is metaphorical until proven, then you're not going to be able to have language in any meaningful capacity. So if we, presupposing that we have our unjustified belief that language, I let you speak, let me speak.
I'm pointing out that you haven't established that. I'm asking you to establish that claim. How many times do I have to ask you that question?
I can't establish that claim, and you can't establish the contrary to that claim.
Sorry, what I showed was, right, that there's no logical inconsistency with God being the type of speaker, right, who doesn't mean for his utterances to be interpreted literally, right? Now, you haven't given me any argument whatsoever, right, to establish that God is not that kind of a speaker, right?
Well, I mean, if we're
when you have an argument like that, right, that God is not that kind of a speaker, right, that's not a circular argument, I will be interested to entertain the argument. I'm not interested in anything else.
Okay, if you're not interested in anything else, I'm not going to talk to you. Like, let's end the conversation here. Because let me finish speaking. I let you speak.
What I wanted to establish from the outset, which is that you didn't have any justification whatsoever for thinking that the Quran lied to God's intentions, and you didn't have any justification whatsoever for thinking that the interpretive principles that you use to interpret the Quran are the correct interpretive principles to use to interpret that document, right? I simply asked you, right, if you had any justification, right?
Okay, so I believe
that you don't have any such justifications, right?
Okay,
that's all I was concerned to establish. Now, if you'd like to say that you do have a justification, just provide the arguments.
Okay, here's my argument. Take it or leave it. The Arabic-speaking world in the time of the Revelation acted off the basic linguistic principle that everything is literal until proven metaphorical. The Quran was revealed in Arabic to Arabic speakers. Therefore, we apply that principle to it. If that's not good enough for you, I can't help you.
Yeah, it's not good enough.
Okay, we're done here.
Yeah, we're done here because you're begging the question, right, that God's intention, right, is for Arabic speakers to employ their ordinary practices to interpret the Quran, right?
How else would they interpret the Quran?
That's the problem.
You're essentially barring any kind of actual interpretation of any holy book at any time, which turns your disbelief in a holy book into an infalsifiable. Let me speak. Which turns your disbelief in any holy book into an infalsifiable claim, and it should be treated in the falsifiable claim should be treated.
I guess saying that understanding my argument, right? No. Let me clarify it for you. What I'm saying is I'm offering a general objection to the possibility of the interpretation of divine utterances, right? Now, that doesn't entail any claim about the existence of God or the non-existence of God, right? I can make independent a priori arguments that God does not exist, right? So I have perfectly good justification for believing that God does not exist, right, on the basis of those a priori arguments. But those arguments are independent, right, of the objection that I'm rendering now, which is that divine utterances are intrinsically uninterpretable, right? Now, you haven't offered me anything, right, to show that my reasoning there is unfounded, right? That there's anything unsound about my reasoning. All you've done is continue to beg the question against the view, right?
Okay, can I respond to that?
To provide an argument, right, that's non-circular, that justifies your belief that the Quran is a reliable guide to God's beliefs and desires, and second, that the interpretive principles that you use, right, to interpret the Quran are the correct ones to use to interpret that document. And you don't have any such argument, right? Now, if you want to give an argument, if you want for once to give an argument for those things, right, that's non-circular, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, we have nothing further to discuss.
Well, I mean, all arguments are contingent upon general epistemology, and epistemology is contingent upon at least one circular axiom. So on that premise, we can't axiomatically say all circular reasoning is in. So that's not an argument. And the fact of the matter is that if you're going to say that all speech that is purportedly divine is uninterpretable by nature, is there any way I can disprove that claim?
Yeah, you could give an a priori argument, right?
No. Is there any argument on the planet is there anything in existence that could disprove that claim about anything?
It's not an empirical claim, right? It's an a priori objection. It's a conceptual objection against the possibility of the interpretability of divine utterances, right? So it's not
what I'm saying is, what can I show you?
It's not a claim that generates predictive expectations, right? What you'd have to do is show that there's a problem in the argument, right, whereby we come to that conclusion.
I understand your line of reasoning, and I'm trying to speak and clarify my position. If you would allow me to do that, I will. And if you won't, I won't have this discussion. Now, what I'm saying is there any extant thing, any specific line of argumentation that I could use to actually prove this about anything to you? Is there any information or any argument? And I'm not just saying, don't just say an argument. Is there anything I could use to, any theoretical thing in existence that I could use to prove this concept to you?
Yeah.
What theoretical thing?
Yeah, you can show that there's an error in the reasoning, right? You can say, yeah, there's some mistake in the reasoning that gets you to that conclusion, right? But see, this is independent, right? I don't actually have to even lay down some general objection to divine utterances, right? All I have to do is ask you, right, if you can give an independent justification for your beliefs about the reliability of the Quran and the reliability of your interpretive principles, right? And it seems like all you can do is give question-begging ones. right? Which is what I said at the outset.
I still don't see how the circular reasoning in regards to language is somehow wrong. Like, and I understand that circular reasoning is inherently fallacious, but as far as I'm concerned, your claim that no